Okay, welcome to the Sarah the Mage Experiment. Today I've got the marvelous Julian Vayne, return guest. I didn't get enough of him in the first time. So, Julian, what have you been up to recently, my friend?
Sarah, thank you very much for inviting me back. Busy with various projects still during the kind of the lockdown period. Mostly what I've been doing recently is some work on a little seditious pamphlet, let's call it, that I produced with Psychedelic Press, which is about a lecture that I was going to give at Oxford University, which for various reasons didn't happen. So that's one of the main things I've been doing, but also, carrying on with the other work that I do. I do lots of kind of online mentoring, and I've been doing a big bunch of filming for someone. So yeah, busy, but all good.
I know another famous magician that was banned from giving a lecture to a famous university. And funnily enough, that ties in slightly to what we're talking about tonight. It was Crowley's famous Giles de Wraith lecture, wasn't it?
That's right, exactly. So to cut a very long story short, I'm just going to give a lecture at the Oxford Psychedelic Society, which is based primarily around the university, but it's not exclusively students. And essentially they would try to find a place for me to do a lecture, and then it turned out that let's call it perhaps a slightly overzealous and very risk-averse member of the administrative team had decided that I would be banned from speaking to the students because of my comments about psychedelic drug use. They described it as illegal drugs, which is, apart from anything else, not the right language or accurate. And they're concerned that perhaps I would be leading the students astray, which, given the fact that in 2018, according to the National Union of Students, about 39% of them were using substances that are considered controlled substances in our culture, is kind of slightly amusing. And yeah, you're right. Like the same university 90 years previously had banned my cultural ancestor, Alistair Crowley, from speaking to the Poetry Society. So what Crowley did was he published the lecture and he gave the proceeds of the lecture's sale to the Poetry Society. So I've done exactly the same thing. So I published the lecture and I'm going to donate the profits to the Oxford Psychedelic Society.
Well, there's a blow for free speech. So what we're going to be talking about tonight is the rather dubious and weird and strange world of conspiracy theories, Julian, and especially the emergence of this weird thing called QAnon. Can you tell me what your understanding of QAnon and why it's become so popular lately? What is it all about, mate?
Oh, I don't know, man. I mean, there's so much in there, isn't there? I mean, really. So as I understand the nub of the idea, that we've got this kind of international conspiracy of Democrats and probably Freemasons and probably Jews, and what they do is they abduct and terrorize children in order to make extractions from their adrenal glands so that they can drink these and live forever or something, and that this kind of like paedophile evil conspiracy was going to be blown apart by a dude called Donald Trump, who I understand is now locked in a cupboard in the White House.
In a bunker. I believe.
Yeah. We've been here before, haven't we?
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting kind of phenomena. I think that there are so many levels to it. I mean, one of the things that I think is really interesting is that it's like it's kind of almost co-opted is perhaps the right word. The desire to wake up, the desire to understand the world and understand the truth of what's happening, that sort of desire that might encourage people towards practices for illumination or enlightenment or whatever, is being sort of seen through what is essentially like a big meta narrative. Yeah. So the whole thing about the QAnon conspiracy, like most large scale conspiracy theories, is that it's an all-embracing narrative. Like everything can be understood by it, whether or not a Hollywood celebrity says the word pizza. Well, when they say the word pizza, they don't mean pizza, they mean abusing children or whatever they're supposed to mean. So it's a kind of a grand narrative. It's certainly what Michel Foucault would have described as a grand narrative. It's that kind of rather like psychoanalysis at its worst, or indeed Marxism at its worst. Like everything fits into this, everything is describable through it. It's a way of making sense of the world And that's a really interesting thing. So it's kind of, it is closer perhaps to a religious sort of ideology than it is to any kind of, you know, political movement, or certainly to kind of any other cultural structure, because it claims to explain everything from what flags are flying to the existence of the global pandemic to, you know, what you ate for breakfast last Tuesday. It's like a whole embracing narrative. And I think that there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there, and it's primarily motivated, I would suggest, by an extreme culture of kind of fear. And you know, you only have to do like half an hour's doom scrolling these days to pick up the virus quite successfully and to be in a very frightened place. And when people are very frightened, what they tend to want to do, what all of us tend to want to do, is we want like a simple solution, like a simple, like, oh man, we're in this morass of what's going on. How can we deal with this? And there are various strategies that can happen. And one of them is the strategy of othering, the strategy of like saying, well, actually, the problem that we're all suffering from is, and then you can insert any group into that or any kind of cultural significators into that to kind of say, you know, this is the problem over here. And we've seen many, many versions of this. I mean, the QAnon thing, although it's the latest rebranding, it's the same kind of like behavior of othering, of scapegoating, of reducing complex problems to simple solutions, plays out again and again and again and again. I mean, you know, I was just kind of looking at some stuff to do with, because you've raised in the conversation of when you sent me a mail about, oh, well, let's talk about sort of, you know, actual conspiracies like Paperclip and MK Ultra and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the interesting things about those is if you look at stuff like what was happening around World War II, with, you know, obviously the Nazis were the masters of othering people. You know, there's a famous poster from Poland, I think it is, which basically says, you know, the Jews have lice and typhoid, and so what we have to do is exterminate the lice and the Jews.
Yeah.
You know, so that kind of othering behavior and that whipping people up into like a fear-based response. And when we have a fear-based response, it's like, you know, the tiger is coming at us. We've got various options. We can play dead, we can run away, we can fight it. That's basically it. But in the complex modern world, most of the time we're not being attacked by tigers. We're finding ourselves enmeshed in this complex web of opinions and beliefs and all kinds of stuff. But our biology is geared up to still want to basically, do we play dead, do we fight, or do we run away?
Yeah.
You know? And when you summon that spirit of fear within the culture, or when that spirit becomes evoked, because I don't think it's, you know, necessarily one terrifying person or group of people doing this, but when that kind of emerges within culture, then we get, you know, critical thinking, and the ability to look at like the complexity of situations tends to fall down, and we look for someone to blame.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that provoked me to do this show was the horrible echoes I saw in the QAnon phenomena and the rhetoric that was going on almost 100 years ago to the month of World War I had just finished. The Western world was in chaos, you know, times of uncertainty, and everybody doesn't know what's happening anymore. And you just find one section of the community and target them. So in those days they had this stab in the back, you know, the myth that the Germans had been betrayed by Jewish financiers and all that kind of stuff. And then there was the Free Corps fighting on the streets of Germany against the communists. And I was thinking it's pretty much like the Proud Boys versus Black Lives Matter, and it's the same rhetoric, and it recurs and recurs. Why is that so hardwired into our, you know?
I don't know. I mean, I think that you know, if you look at if you go right back to the ancient Jewish ritual of the scapegoat, you know, which was a thing. It was an animal that was driven out from the community.
I know it well, yes.
And I think that appears to be a human behavior. And in a way, it's interesting, particularly at the moment, because it's rather like this idea of kind of a contagion, like the idea that there's something wrong, there's something diseased. And so what we have to do is we have to rip that out. We have to destroy that thing. We have to burn it with fire, ideally. And so that's a kind of like a behavior which under certain circumstances is probably useful. You know, you've got an injury that requires the removal of whatever, then it's got to be taken out. It's part of the kind of the process that we have. And I think that there are so many examples of it. So I've recently become a member of a social media group where people are discussing a thing called Pagan Link. So Pagan Link was set up in the 1980s in Britain, and it was a sort of an ad hoc kind of network of people running from the sort of mid-late 80s through into the 90s. And the interesting thing within this group is that to remind myself of what was happening at the time. So what was happening at the time in culture was there was a kind of a newspaper called the News of the World. And the News of the World was publishing all kinds of things about, you know, children at naked witchcraft rituals and this kind of salacious sort of material. And people were getting, you know, social services coming around to their houses. People were getting bricks through their windows. People were losing their jobs and so on. And it's the same thing. You go back to the beginning of the 20th century and you look at the story of the example I often give to people is Leo Taxil. So Leo Taxil, like, I don't know if you know this particular
Never
narrative.
heard that story.
Okay. So there's a thing like, if you just go to Wikipedia and have a look at Leo Taxil. So Leo Taxil was a guy who was writing. He was a writer. He was a very anti-religious, anti-Catholic writer, French dude, writing in the late 1800s. And he was a very interesting character. He was a kind of a bit of a joker, more than a bit of a joker. And he realized that it was actually relatively easy to get people to believe crazy things. And because he was very anti-Catholic, what he decided eventually to do, to cut a very long and fascinating story short, is he had a very public conversion to Catholicism. And then over the course of the next decade, he wrote all these books all about that there was like a kind of Jewish Freemasonic Baphomet worshipping, child killing kind of cult. And then after about 10 years, and he got really far with this. He had an audience with the Pope, you know, the French.
Actually, now you mention it.
Yeah,
exactly.
So this is the dude. So he creates this whole thing. And then after about 10 years, he holds a massive press conference and says, do you know what? This is all nonsense. And I did this to prove to myself and to all you people about how prejudiced you were, how easily you were taken in, how you wanted to believe all this, that the evil was out there, that it was somewhere else, you know, and actually turns out it's actually with all of you guys. It's actually with all of your sort of behaviors. And, you know, he had to be given a police escort to the nearest cafe. You know, people were not happy with the dude. And then, of course, that whole that trope of the kind of, you know, Freemasonic, devil worshipping, eyes wide shut kind of thing just rumbles on and keeps on trucking. And you can, the thing about a lot of this kind of stuff is that it's really, if you go and sort of start to tease apart the strands, you can see quite clearly that, yes, abuse happens, bad stuff happens, but abuse happens because people are abusers, not necessarily because they are members of organization X or Y. Certain organizations maybe create the conditions where it's very hard to challenge abuse. So the abuse we've seen, for example, within certain parts of the Christian community, if you have a community which is very kind of authoritarian, where sex is seen as like dirty and evil, and the original sin and so on, it becomes very difficult to kind of address what's actually going on in those communities. It's very easy for things to become hidden within those kind of structures. But that's not the same as saying Christians are, by dint of their Christianity, abusive individuals, any more than it makes sense to say in the 1980s, pagans, because of the virtue of their paganism, are these abusive individuals. Or that Democrats, by virtue of them being Democrats in the modern age, they are therefore these kind of abusive individuals. It just simply doesn't follow.
It seems to me a massive oversimplification of, you know, we are buffeted by media every day. We've got Facebook, we've got Twitter, we've got YouTube, and they're all battering us with all these conflicting ideas of what is right, what is wrong. And I think people are drowning in a sea of baffling information. And for people who are, you know, one of the main things I didn't want to do in this program was to to other the people that are, you know, that are having these ideas, because I can understand them in a certain extent. If you've been, you know, brought up in a good Christian family, and then suddenly people are talking about the layman, cakes of light, and, you know, Crowley did talk rather irresponsibly, in my mind, sacrificing the male child and all that. And they're obviously going to look at occultists as freaks and dangerous satanic child killers.
Yeah, it makes total sense, and that's why I said at the beginning, I think that the QAnon thing about like wake up sheeple, that idea of like, you know, come to a realization about what's really going on, in a way that's a laudable desire, but I think that it's then, well, how do you answer what that is? How do you deal with that, like you say, that kind of complexity of data? And you've got if you think about the way that the human nervous system operates, we've got, you know, and you look at there's a field called polyvagal theory, and you can look at how we have nervous structures which, in the face of challenging circumstances, we can freeze or we can fight, and that includes flight as well, running away, and that in order to deal with social processing, in order to deal with the kind of complexity of the world in which we live, and the kind of the different messages and opinions, and, you know, who can we trust and who can we not, the issue for me is, and this is where it kind of gets into like what I express as magical practice, which is that how do we find places, how do we find resources within ourselves, and how do we find techniques and approaches which allow us to sit with that complexity and sit with that uncertainty? So to give a really, really simple example, one of the things we can do with polyvagal theory is we can work with our vagus nerve, and we can get into a state which is both relaxed and alert. And that's usually what we want with meditation. And what we also know with meditation practice, and I'm thinking here just like bog standard mindfulness of breath, John Kabat-Zinn style stuff, what we have with that as a practice is we have a way of sitting with uncertainty, of observing our own thoughts, and of bringing our thoughts back to a given anchor, usually our breath. And in that practice, what it does is it allows a downregulation of the amygdala, which is the structure in the brain which mediates a lot of our fear. And it allows
Is that the reptilian brain there? The
yeah. Let's call it that.
So-called.
Yeah. So and we can move from that to a place where we are able to basically engage more of the kind of cognitive faculties of our brain. So we know that when people do meditation for, it doesn't have to be a long, actually. You can do like 20 minutes for 6 weeks to get a change in the brain that can be seen in an fMRI scanner. And what happens to those people is that those people become cognitively more alert. They also become more relaxed, and they also become better able to deal with complexity, right? Whereas if you ramp the amygdala up, if you spend your half an hour every day doom scrolling instead of doing your meditation, you will very soon find, and you can see it in the brain. If you put someone in an fMRI scanner, you can see the amygdala actually kind of become, you know, more complex, more dendritic connections, bigger, if you like. And you can see that the kind of the cognitive sections of our brain kind of decrease, and that includes the interpersonal skills that we have. So the biggest bit of the human brain is the bit that allows us to have interpersonal social relationships. But in order to have those successfully, we've got to be alert and also relaxed. Like I'm at the moment alert because I'm chatting to you, but reasonably relaxed because it's my friend Sarah. There we go. We're having a chat. Fantastic. It's easy, you know. And that's the state that allows us to engage with all the experiences that we have as a social being. And that's the best state. You know, it allows actually the biggest, in terms of dendritic connections and pure volume, the biggest bits of our brains to come online. And if we don't do those kinds of practices, or we are not supported in finding whatever our way is to meditate, yeah, whether that's art, whether it's gardening, whether it's like, you know, whatever it happens to be, the thing that allows us to come into like a center and to observe our own awareness arising, and also just to breathe into that and allow ourselves to accept the fact that we cannot know everything in the world. We have to be able to be able to deal with that uncertainty, not by finding a simple resolution, but by acknowledging that that is how it is, you know. And our cultures, by and large, in Euro-American culture, however we want to describe us, we're not very good at it. We're not very good at it,
Terrible at it, to be honest.
yeah, yeah. And so it's unsurprising that when something comes along, whether it's like Leo Taxil's joke, or whether it's the Nazis talking about Jews, or whether or not it's QAnon talking about Hollywood pedophiles, and we can just go, oh, I don't have to deal with all that uncertainty anymore. I don't have to sit with that uncertainty anymore. I can outsource this to this thing.
Yeah.
What also happens, and this is really fascinating, is that if there was this kind of like great overarching, terrifying conspiracy, blah, 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 you'd think that there would be more concern arising for the victims of this kind of thing. And actually what happens is that it becomes less about concern and a desire to assist those who are in trauma, and it becomes much more about, oh, those pedos, we need to get them and we need to kill them and we need to garrot them. And you read some of the stuff, man, and it's like really proper, like, people evoking their inner Thomas de Torque Armada. They're really having a nice time, it would seem, writing lots of stuff about the vile things that they want to do to other people, how they want to scapegoat. Meanwhile, there's all these people theoretically abused by Hollywood stars, but more likely abused by members of their own family and their own community, who they're not very interesting. Actually dealing with the real abusive problems that we have within our culture, that's like not the thing. What I'm more interested in is attacking these mythic evil monsters over there. And like Nietzsche says, you battle with the monsters and you're going to become a monster yourself. That's how it leads then to pitchforks and stuff going on, Kristallnacht and all of that kind of behavior.
Yeah, I definitely think that pedophilia has become a sort of late 20th, early 21st century obsession. It's absolutely, they are the boogeyman. So it's not Jews anymore, it's pedophiles, but let's make it more interesting by making the celebrities and the, people that are powerless and feel a victim of every earthquake and tornado that smashes their trailer park to bits. It's easy for them to say, oh, look at those guys up there in their ivory men. They're obviously doing it through satanic rituals and drinking adrenochrome. That's why they're successful.
And yeah, you're totally right. The other thing about this is that it's just that if you go back through history, you see this again and again and again and again. The early modern witch trials, that's what they did. Witches at their Sabbath, at their synagogue, which was one of the words that was commonly used.
Synagogue so witches of Satan.
Yeah. So they were chopping up babies, they were killing babies. That's what it was about. And I think that the focus on sexuality is really interesting. I think that again tells us a lot about our the fears associated with that, and whether or not that's also kind of linked in an interesting way to the fear about, particularly perhaps within certain parts of American culture, with the fear of like the breakdown of gender identity, the breakdown of what are perceived as common family structures, and also, of course, within the United States, the fact that you've got like a large number of communities who are very strongly influenced by a millennialist Christianity.
Yeah.
These are to parody it, and I realize this is a parody. This is a group of people who are descended from those who left Europe because there wasn't enough religious prejudice anymore. Basically, what they went over to go and genocide on somebody else's landscape in order that they could set up their own isolated community in order to wait for the apocalypse.
Yeah, Europe wasn't extreme enough, so they went to a new continent to oh god, decimate the Indians, dare I say?
Yeah. I mean, that's by no means the full story, but that's certainly an important aspect of the story. And I think that's really, it's really interesting. I often think that in a way, the natural religion of like white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans should be Satanism, because it kind of goes beyond the apocalyptic and into some really interesting territory. If you look at things like the Satanic Temple, for example, with their kind of radical political work, and a lot of their kind of their 7 satanic principles are far more moral than a lot of the other kind of
Absolutely.
stuff that I've seen kind of coming out of some of those cultures. So yeah, this is where we are, because we share the same language with many of the people in that community. We get the kind of the backwash of that, and so the QAnon thing, unfortunately, is alive and well. It will be interesting to see how that plays out when Donald finally comes out of his bunker. Who knows?
If he ever does.
If he ever does, if he ever does, they might just want to kind of shut him in a cupboard somewhere in the White House so that he believes that he's still president, and he can be like one of those, sort of imagined, I don't know, what would it be, sort of, the early
Like King
Victorian
Arthur,
crazy uncle. Yeah, just like lives in the West
sleeping
Wing
under
of
Glastonbury Tor.
yeah, yeah. Well, he lives in the west wing of the house, and we don't, we've walled up the wall, but he still thinks that he's the lord of the manor, and we occasionally go and sort of, we can hear him sort of scrabbling at the stonework. But yeah, I mean, it's a very, very interesting situation. But it's not like we haven't been here before. It's not like we can't look back at the historical stuff. But if you start engaging with the QAnon thing, one of the things that's very interesting, I think, is that it's ahistoric. So it's if you start saying, well, but haven't we seen this behavior before? Haven't we seen these processes play out before? I think it's very difficult for people, once they've kind of gone down that particular rabbit hole of conspiracy, to start to kind of pull back from that and see that what's happening is just the latest iteration. This is just baby eating evil people version 4.0, whatever it happens to be.
Yeah. I mean, they can't say it's Jews anymore, so I feel like they've kind of said it's interdimensional reptilian beings.
Yeah, because it's you're clearly not being racist when you talk about an interdimensional reptilian being, are you? Although it's very interesting who these interdimensional reptilian beings are in their physical form. I mean, I was just again following up the thing about, you mentioned MK Ultra as a real conspiracy. Of course, bad stuff happens. Yeah, real stuff happens. But if you look at the commission that was done in, I think, the 1970s, mid-late 1970s, into the whole MK Ultra thing, part of that was done by a member of the Rockefeller family. Now, okay, so the problem with the QAnon thing, again, is that every single thing you say will be understood only through the lens of that meta-narrative. So if you said, well, hang on, MK Ultra was blown apart in part by a commission that was led by one of the Rockefellers, you go, yeah, well, that's part of the conspiracy, isn't it? That's part of the, you can't, there is no winning, because it's like trying to have a discussion with like a hardcore evangelical Marxist or a hardcore evangelical almost anything. Is that I remember having a discussion with some Jehovah's Witnesses at the doorstep many years ago, and me saying, well, but hasn't the Bible gone through lots of different edits and transliterations and versions and so on? So how do we know that like the one that you're presenting me with is the true word of God? And they said, well, but that's the Bible that God has given us in this time. So it's like, well, man, there's nothing for me to do. Is there? Like, no. Okay, that's simply your belief, and we have to kind of just pin it at that. That's why I get more interested in like, well, what's the technique? What's the approach? What are people actually doing? Because if with the QAnon thing, you're kind of like doom scrolling, and then you're acting out your own kind of fantasies of murdering evil pedos or whatever it happens to be, and then you're going on like anti-mask demonstrations or whatever it happens to be that you're doing, like that seems to me that that's a very limited repertoire for dealing with like a complex set of problems in the world that you believe you understand. And that if you don't have some kind of, and I'll use the word again just as a placeholder for it, some sort of meditation process, some process which allows you to sit with what is and to be in that space of like uncertainty, and to recognize that that's part of the human condition, and to kind of observe your own thought processes, and also to kind of question and even to show a degree of humor about this kind of stuff. So if you don't have any like process to bring you meta to it, to bring you kind of above what it is you believe and look down on it again and say, oh, that looks interesting from this new viewpoint. Using magic, meditation, whatever, is about getting a new viewpoint on your life, on what's going on. And those structures don't invite you to do that. They invite you to consume and absorb a strong meta narrative, which will prove everything by dint of the way it proves it. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, but one novel feature of the QAnon thing is it's not saying, like the protocols of Zion or all that. The Jew said this. It's like, oh, they'll give you little cryptic clues, and then it encourages followers to, it's like a treasure hunt. So they're all involved, they're getting in communities, and it's kind of an innovation in the world of conspiracy theory.
I think that's true. I mean, it's definitely, there's that there's a couple of sort of entertaining things I've seen of people saying, I'm a researcher. In other words, I've got a connection to the internet and I know how to type stuff.
Yeah.
And I see, apart from anything else, with the blog of Baphomet, I see the search terms that people use to find or they end up at the blog of Baphomet. And there are a number of search terms where it's just like, it's all about like Baphomet, conspiracy, Freemasons, Illuminati, whatever. So it's like a self-assembly thing. But of course, because of the data sources that are available, and also because of the actors, people who are active in that field, it's not quite as much of a sort of a free form treasure hunt as I think it might appear, because it's like there are kind of significators within that. There are kind of key points within that, of which, of course, the idea that Donald Trump was the savior who was going to destroy the deep state, bizarrely, was one of them.
How did he ever get that role?
I think he got that role partly because I remember I really should have put money on this, because I was pretty sure that he was going to be elected, unfortunately.
I was too. I had a feeling.
Yeah. And I think that's because I remember, with my eldest son, we were kind of joking about the idea of doing top trumps, like top trumps, like the game Top Trumps.
Oh, yes.
Because I worked for like a museum where we did like a Top Trump series with the objects in this museum. And my son and I were saying, oh, we could do like top trumps of like crazy things that Donald Trump has said, his crazy things. And you could have like a score, like it's this
a
crazy.
Level of craziness, stupidness, ignorant,
racism, sexism, whatever. And the interesting thing was that we started looking through Donald Trump's statements, because I was thinking, oh, is he anti-abortion or is he pro-life or whatever. And the interesting thing about Trump as a character and as an individual who's been thrown forward because he thinks he's done it himself, but of course he's the emergence of a whole bunch of stuff, is that he sort of doesn't stand for anything, which is kind of interesting. So it's a bit like a Taoist master. If you go back and look at his record on like what he said about like abortion, or what he said about like almost any subject, he continuously either deliberately reverses, or he says he's got form for this, isn't he? Well, I don't remember that, or no, that's not what I said. And he'll just totally lie and say, no, that's not what I said. I said something completely different. And so what you've got is like he's like a rather bizarrely, for a character who seems so full, he's actually incredibly empty. So you can project whatever you think. The Donald Trump that you want is the Donald Trump that you are able to summon, because you can go through his material and you can sort of say, oh, he actually believes in, like, he's against prohibition of drugs, and he's for sovereign rights, and he's loved by the Hispanic community, and he's that sort of everyman kind of figure in some respects.
I hate to draw the comparison, but Hitler did exactly the same, as I understand. He would not take responsibility for any major decisions, and he's going to delegate them out. It's a demagogue, archetypal demagogue.
And you get this really interesting thing where people sort of say, well, that he's this kind of like special character, in the same way that with the Führer there was this idea of like when when Germany was going through huge amounts of turmoil, particularly towards the end of the Second World War, a huge amount of privation. The people would often say, well, if the Führer knew about what was going on, then he'd fix it. But it's all the underlings, and it's all the other kind of people. Whereas he himself becomes this kind of pure, ideologically, pristine kind of character that we can pin our ideas kind of onto. And again, it's rather like there's this really, really complex problem called being a human in the 21st century. And we want a simple solution to that. And the simple solution will be wrong, because complex problems by their very nature involve us having to sit with uncertainty, to engage the critical faculties of our brains, to have a sense of perspective through historical precedent and context, and to be able to deal with nuance, to be able to deal with like the complexity of this kind of thing. And that's why it becomes very easy to say, Satanists, they're abusers, or even Catholics, they're abusers, or whatever, rather than actually to say, how come these abusive elements within our culture exist? Where do they mainly exist? How do we support victims in this kind of these situations? How do we long-term address these issues within our communities? How do we deal with this, rather than just going, we just need to re-elect Donald and then he'll fix everything.
Yeah. So how do we deal with these problems in our communities?
Whoa, mate. I think we have to do what.
Don't expect one just quick answer there, but
no, I think the answer, the answer, I think, is the one that was on the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, where it says, "Know thyself." And know thyself is a practice. Know thyself is not, in my opinion, a thing you wake up to one day and you go, it's God, marvelous. It's Tuesday morning. That's it. It's all done and dusted now. It's about having a practice which allows the knowledge of oneself to emerge in every moment. And that's why I was pointing at something like meditation or other kind of practices that allow us to deal with our fear, to sit with uncertainty, and to build up our ability to work with the social interpersonal capacity within us. And so what we have to do is we have to both take the responsibility as individuals to have practices which question our own beliefs, which use humor to subvert our own ideas, which use the opportunities to sit with uncertainty, which encourage us to reach outside the echo chambers that we often find ourselves inhabiting. And we have to try and support other people when they find practices that do that for them, to do that for them. And those practices also include like really sitting with, well, what are our emerging kind of ethical feelings about things, and how do we carry on our existence in the world in a way that really meets the needs of what we express as our emotional desires. So, for example, if we think that abusing children is wrong, then that's really good. Clearly it is. So what do we do? What do we do? Do we join some organization to support kids in our local area, to support people who've been in that? Do we donate money? Do we kind of like, what structures in our culture might we have that might actually help us? And if we find ourselves spending more of our time thinking about how we would like to kill members of the Hollywood set, and what terrifying things we would like to visit on them in the form of chemical or physical castration, we might think, well, actually, I don't know if I'm really in the space that is about helping save people from abuse or stopping abuse. I might actually be finding myself just enacting the same behavior against the people who I believe to be wrong and evil. Like, there's a really good example of this. I saw going around Facebook a little while ago, a figure like, I don't know what it was. It was like, it was a figure to do with in Britain, how many children go missing every year. And it was a very big figure. I forget what it was, but it was large. It was like either tens or possibly, tens of thousands, let's say. So I thought, this is terrible. This is terrible. I didn't know that was, it's been put around in that kind of QAnon envelope. So I went and had a look at what I consider to be a decent source of information. And that's the other thing we have to think about in this practice of knowing thyself, questioning Who do I trust? I have to trust people every day, right? Back in the day when I got on an aeroplane, I had to trust that the pilot knew what was going on and the ground crew knew what was going on. We have to trust people every day. So I went and had a look at the British government stats on missing children. And yes, lots of children do go missing every year. And actually, almost all of them, the vast, vast majority, like 90-something% of them, are found within 24 hours.
Yeah.
Right. So if you dig down in the figures, what you find lots of alienated and sad youth who are kind of going, that's it, I'm leaving. And they go off for like 24 hours and eventually the police find them and bring them back or whatever. So you have to then start to think, oh, that's really sad. So what's happened in that family? What provoked that? You look at the number of children who do appear to have gone into kind of, they're either working on weed farms or they're a sex slave or whatever. And it's significant, yeah? So it's still numberable in, like, I think the figure was something like, 2,000 that was being looked at. And I went and looked at these figures and broke all this figure down. And that was really interesting. And it was really interesting for me because I thought, okay, so firstly, if I really, and I work in a public building, I've got kind of responsibilities for safeguarding and all that sort of stuff. So I'm engaged in this work. But if I wanted to address that trauma, then the first thing I need to know is have some critical ability to actually take this big figure of like QAnon abducting this many children. Firstly, I need to find out, is that true, before I just hit share on my site and just like send the thing along. I have to find what I consider to be a reliable source of data. And then I can start looking at, like, well, what is the actual problem? What's going on here? Is it true that 100,000 children or whatever it is are being taken for their adrenochrome glands by the Hollywood? No, it isn't. It isn't. It's actually much more about poor people, people in abusive families and relationships. It's about people who've got like substance misuse issues. It's like, it's all the usual stuff, which is all incredibly kitchen sink and boring, isn't it, really? That's not very exciting. That's not what allows me to get with my pitchfork and my flaming torch and go and burn someone's house down. Like the dude who was, that's the famous story in Wales of the guy who was the paediatrician that found that, like that. Like, I've got mates, I've spoken to about that. That genuinely happened. That genuinely happened, right? Now, I accept that people make mistakes and stuff happens, things go out of control, whatever. But like, let's think down what happened there. So someone misunderstood what the word pediatrician means, i.e. child, a doctor who cares specifically for children and young people. And it turned into a situation where, like, there's a mob at this guy's door. So, like this, if we're going to engage with this material, we have to engage with the process of knowing thyself. And that means, engaging with all of those critical abilities and supporting the ability, our ability to analyze and to think and to be social creatures without falling into this amygdala mediated fear-based response. And however we do that, whether we do that through doing some gardening, whether we do that through our meditation or our ritual practice or whatever we do, whether we do that through our spiritual tradition or we do it through some much more kind of pragmatic means, we must have those things and we must encourage other people to engage in that kind of stuff. It's very, very difficult with someone who's fallen down the QAnon rabbit hole to get them to laugh at any of those ideas. And I have to think one of the acid tests is whether or not you can laugh at your own crazy beliefs. Like, I'm a bloody magician. I laugh at my stuff all the time. Like, what a crazy set of ideas. Yeah. Very funny. And having that kind of ability to stand meta to what's going on and to analyze it and see it in that way, that's what we need to encourage. We don't do that very successfully in our education system. It's better than it was, but still not ideal in the British Isles. And we certainly don't encourage people as they get older to engage in that process. So I didn't see anyone going, oh, here's this terrifying figure of the number of children who are abused. By the way, here's a link to the government stats, which will tell you that nearly all of them are found within like 24 hours. Because that's not where it's coming from. It's coming from a much more simplistic, fear-based response.
Yeah. Obviously we've had coronavirus this year, but apart from that, it's been a pretty steady year. There's been no wars, I guess Trump didn't declare war on Iran or Iraq. So who is profiting from these ideas? Who is suffering from these ideas? And, you know, I do feel like there is an agenda. There's the believers and there's the people that are, there you go. Is it the Illuminati? that
I don't
are,
know. I mean, I often I go with a lot like Alan Moore on this one, where he said, you know, the thing about conspiracy theories is that they're a way of not addressing the ultimate terror, which is that there is no one in charge. There is no one in charge, and yes, there are like micro conspiracies. There are people out there. You know, I'm sure that there are members of various pharmaceutical boards who are terribly happy about the fact that they think that they've got to the point where there's a vaccine for the coronavirus. Like, let's assume, I mean, I've just been chatting to a mate who's a clinician, and they're having to deal with people who are, you know, all sorts of levels of this. Like, they know as a clinician that the vaccine data isn't published yet, so we don't know how effective this thing is. And so there's a lot of kind of medics who are very uncertain about it, because normally it takes like several years to get to a vaccine that's successful, assuming we believe that vaccines work. You know, that's a whole nother kind of thing. But also they're dealing with people who clearly are ill with COVID-19, who are saying, no, 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 I've not got COVID, cough, cough, cough. I can't breathe, but that's because I've got like, I've got a bronchial infection. Just give me some antibiotics. And my mate's going, no, look, I'm absolutely sure the test has come back positive. I've nursed loads of people in this situation. You've definitely got it. And they're going, no, I don't believe it. So I think the thing is that there is no single agenda. There are people who are profiting for one reason or another, like the people who may have produced a successful vaccine for this thing. But then where did we expect the vaccine was going to come from, other than a big pharmaceutical giant? Like, I looked down the back of my sofa and I couldn't see a vaccine for COVID there. And I looked inside my fridge and there wasn't any vaccine there. So I assume that probably a big drug firm will come up with it, you know, assuming that's actually a real, you know, that we believe that this is all real, whatever. So some people will profit from this situation in the same way that Joe Wicks has profited from the lockdown. But whether or not
he's
Joe
done
Wicks
very well.
Indeed, but whether or not Joe Wicks actually was responsible for like the advent of the coronavirus, I sort of doubt very much. So I think that the agenda is like it's not like a plan that's deployed. It's more like a series of emergent properties, and some of those are going to be things like, you know, let's look at dear old Nigel Farage, who seems to ride on the wave of any particular prejudicial fantasy that people are living in. That's what he does. That's what this dude's role is. So it's, for me, it's fairly simple that like this is a person within the ecology of our community who feeds off of fear and likes to ride high on that storyline. So yeah, there are definitely people who are kind of on the make out of this. I mean, I would imagine that the deplatforming of David Icke from things like YouTube, I bet the guy's coining it in. Fantastic, brilliant. Well, you know, whatever. I think that this kind of stuff that he said, from the little that I've encountered, I find incredibly dubious, and you know, I basically have very little time for it at all.
I actually listened to a 3-part David Icke broadcast this afternoon as part of my research.
Indeed.
For the show, and it was just intolerably dull, but groundless. And he makes these bizarre. So he said, you know, like Shabbatai V, the Sabbatean movement in Turkey. So he made a sudden leap from that to Frankism, and then he said, okay, so Frankism, that the dudes that were into that Frankism converted to Catholicism, so they took over the Vatican. And it's these simplistic steps, you know. So what, they took over the Vatican just because there was a couple hundred converts? It's the simplifying of these immensely complex structures that no one can understand.
And the thing is that also these are social structures, and so any social structure, like a political party or a family or anything, it's not full of goodies and baddies. Like, that's not how life works by and large. there are all kinds of different people, and they have their good days and they have their bad days, and they make good decisions and they make poor decisions and so on. But the idea of like this kind of it takes away the humanity of those individuals. It takes away actually, to some extent, it stops you believing in them as like kind of fully fledged functioning humans. They are, again, it's this othering kind of process. So you look at something like again, the example that from my earlier on research, looking at what I consider to be a reasonable source of information, which is a thing called Wikipedia, looking at the MK Ultra story and looking at how that was kind of eventually came into the public sphere. And you can see how like this happened because of a combination of journalism and American government action, you know, to look at like the CIA and its overreach and the crazy things that they did. And it's perhaps unsurprising they did a bunch of crazy things because they just imported a big load of Nazi scientists who'd been in a situation where they could do science with no moral boundaries on it. Like, you know, if you look at something like, you know, the Nazi regime, because they dehumanized the Jews to such an extent, they were doing terrifying things to those poor people.
Yeah, not just Jews.
And disabled people and gay people and occultists and Freemasons and, you know, black people and whatever. Yeah, totally. But that, so these are all complicated stories. These are all complicated stories. And the idea of just like the goodies and the baddies and that sort of narrative that people like Ike spin, and indeed people like Farage and people like Trump, and to some extent people like Johnson, you know, it's reassuringly simple in the face of a complex world. And what we need to do instead, again, is to know thyself. And that includes, to know thyself includes, I live in this really complex world, and I just have to accept that that's how it is. And so I have to have strategies that I continuously develop, refine and review that allow me to live in this complex world and not to seek refuge in a simple answer, particularly a simple answer, which seems to be predicated on othering and hating on another group of people.
Yeah, one of the things that made me really, I'd kind of gone into YouTube retirement, but I saw a very chilling clip on the news of a column of marching guys in camouflage gear and automatic weapons, a militia, basically. And they were walking through an American state unimpeded, you know, like a private army. And then, to be honest, to give the other side, there were black guys marching with automatic weapons. Kind of, you know, I thought it was fucking helter skelter, as Charlie Manson would say.
Yeah. And again, it's that thing about you know, one of the things about I guess knowing thyself is also kind of recognizing that there's those kind of simplistic divisions of like black and white and the sort of Antifa and the Proud Boys and all that kind of stuff. One of the things that's really important to understand with this stuff is how you can break down the edges of what appears to be a them and us situation. And so that's why at the beginning of this, I kind of said, I totally understand with a lot of the QAnon thing, where this idea of like, we must wake up, we must take some action, we must do something. And I agree that we must do something, but what we must do is address the fact that we have a massively unequal culture, which is eating the earth and destroying the whole of the biosphere. And we have like vast epidemics of mental illness, now hugely exacerbated by the global pandemic. And it's those things undoubtedly need addressing, but they're not going to be addressed by the simple solution of shooting a bunch of people who look different from me. Yeah. That's just not gonna work. The ice caps are still going to carry on melting, my friend. You know, the ecological disaster and the mass extinctions will still keep happening. So it's like it's a bit like fighting over the chairs on the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Yeah. You know? But don't you think there's that, you know, these, I don't want to stigmatize anyone, and that was never my intention, but there's this mass, the middle of America seems to believe if you just pray hard enough, it's all going to go away, you know. How do we bring these people to the realization that climate change is real and social injustice is real, and we're not going to talk them over with liberal rhetoric, are we?
I think we have to do this. I think we have to do it slowly. And what I mean by that is, like, one of the things about the QAnon kind of conspiracy thing is, it's like the Great Awakening is going to happen any minute now, just like the Second Coming is going to happen any minute now. And actually what we need to do as human beings is we need to kind of start to think beyond our individual lifespans and our own individual cultures, and start to think about, in that kind of 7 generations down the line kind of thing. That's where we need to be with this. So rather than getting a panicked answer about, well, what must I do in this moment, most of the changes are small and incremental. So I'll give you an example. Like my children are teenagers, right? So if I like to think that they're kind of like kindly individuals and thoughtful and so on. And if I talk to them about, like, stuff from my childhood in terms of the way that, say, male homosexuality, which is decriminalized in Britain a year before I was born, right? From their point of view, it's like, why would you even be prejudiced against a gay person? Or why would you even, and actually almost beyond that, into like, why do we even need to talk about sexual identities? Why can't we just, like, be people and have whatever relationships we have? And if they're consensual and kind, then that's all good. So that change has happened by dint of all kinds of tiny little things, plays on the TV, books, culture, all sorts of little changes that make it seem utterly bizarre. In the same way that, like, from my point of view, I don't expect women who are married to have their hair covered. And yet in Christian culture, for a long period of time, that was like what you did. So all of those kind of incremental changes, all of those ways of broadening people's understanding that seem so piecemeal and seem so tiny. So even to the extent of us having this conversation here, which might perhaps engage somebody and allow them to kind of just question very gently whether or not the narrative that they have absorbed, that seems to explain everything in the world, might itself be problematic and might have stuff associated with it which is not helpful either to themselves or the wider community. All of those tiny little changes add up to something. Or, many a mickle makes a muckle, I believe is one of the expressions. Forgive my pronunciation. So lots of little things adds up to a big change. And that's why, you want to do QAnon? Fantastic. You want to wake up sheeple? Brilliant. Why don't you as well take your half an hour doom scrolling and turn that into half an hour's meditation and just see how you go? Yeah, just see how you go. Download the Headspace app, or just sit there in the nice chill room and just do the Kabat-Zinn style breathing meditation and see how that affects your subsequent interactions, and whether or not you're prepared to hit share without passing it through the more complex cognitive bit of your brain, which might make you think, I wonder if that is that many children. I wonder if that's really the case.
Yeah. It's not the case.
Little by little. When my Tai Chi teacher, every time that he takes you through a set, takes you through whatever's going on, and he'll just say, little by little, we'll get there, little by little, just gently, gently, gently. Because we want, like, the big boom, here's the answer. And again, that's a little bit like this kind of like really simple kind of process. And I think that, unfortunately, from the point of view of humans who want things now and in our lifetime, what we have to do is we have to work to ensure that the people 7 generations down the line aren't sitting in the howling wreckage of a dying planet, and that there are many, 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 many things that have to come into play in order to make that 7th generation thrive and be well. And whatever we can do, whatever tiny things we can do to support that are worth doing.
Fantastic. So as a last question, Julian, where is the QAnon movement going now, do you think? Trump is obviously, he's going to hold on for as long as he can. But I mean, Biden is legally the president-elect. I think it's going to kind of dig in further underground and continue.
It's quite possible. I mean, the thing is, I think what we can take as a lesson from history is that this behavior is not going to go away. That's why we have to do all those little things to try and encourage people to have a broader repertoire than just this simple behavior, because QAnon will reinvent itself in some form or another. You know, a new face or faces will arise to be the front of those kind of beliefs and ideas. And that's why you need a knowledgeable and educated and compassionate society, and you need to cultivate that. So what's going to happen to QAnon? It will mutate, it will change, it will re-emerge in some other form. And its basic tropes, which will be that people in positions of power or people on the outskirts or the edges of whatever the society in question deems to be acceptable. So whether that's occultists or whether or not that's like, I don't know, whatever kind of radical, you know, queer people or whatever it happens to be, that these people are the enemy. Those behaviors will be exactly the same. Those scapegoating behaviors, just like the scapegoat that the ancient Jewish tribes would send off into the wilderness, there will always be a scapegoat. And so we have to just work with our own processes, and we also have to create cultures which mitigate this fact. So we have to create structures within culture which are designed to mitigate the fact that power, generally speaking, does potentially lead to abuse. And if you take the example of the American presidency, one of the things that's really come out of this that I've really seen, and I think a lot of my American friends have seen, is that the position of president is far too autocratic. It's far too powerful. It's like it's frighteningly like the Roman Empire, yeah, where the crazy dude at the top can do any number of insane things. And the Roman Empire got pretty bad. Like, you know, Nero, not a nice man. You know, Tiberius, not a cool dude, not really. You know, when you have a dictator, a benign dictator, oh, everything's fine. But mostly they're not. And so I think that creating social structures which allow us to be really thoughtful about the capacity of power to corrupt and for power relationships to become abusive, we have to have structures which provide checks and balances to offset and mitigate those things wherever possible. You know, in the same way that going right the way back to the 17th century, to the Basque witch trials, what the Pope did was, when the Basque witch region was gripped by the fear of witchcraft panic, he sent someone to go and investigate. And the person, the inquisitor he sent to investigate, was one of the first people in European history to look at what's the evidence for what's going on, you know? So we have to have people from perhaps outside a situation come in to make judgments about things, because if people do that within their own communities, all kinds of difficulties can kind of emerge. And within that practice of dealing with the way that power is able to corrupt and lead to abusive relationships, you then need to have an ability to cultivate compassion, because that's why in the Charge of the Goddess in Wicca, it talks about power and compassion. So you can have power, but if you don't have compassion with it, if you don't believe that the other, this thing, this lice, this vile, democratic, Hollywood pedo, unless you can understand that that is also you, that no man is an island, and that is also part of the body of society that you live in, and you have to address things in that way. You have to have that compassion arising as well. Otherwise, real serious shit goes down.
Well said, sir. Okay, Julian Vayne, I think that will probably do it, sir.
Mate.
Anything you want to announce to my millions of hundreds of...
I mean, if anyone, I've got a product placement. Here we go.
Oh, go on then.
Right, okay. So this is the banned lecture of getting higher. That's the story that we alluded to at the beginning about. So it's a little short pamphlet. It's available on Psychedelic
Feel free
Press.
To send me that free, by the way, Julian. Since
yes, mate. Yeah, but if you ping me your address after this, and I'll scribble on the thing, and I'll send it to you.
I'm trying to build up a library for the young'uns, you know. So
yeah, totally. Yeah. So you know, people can find that on psychedelicpress.co.uk, and you know, I'm around generally doing things. People can get in touch.
You're barely, I mean, I barely knew you, and you gave me an interview. It's actually 2 now.
total media whore, my friend. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, that's part of the deal. I mean, the thing is, part of what I like doing is I like collaborating and working with other people. Yeah. So I've written, I don't know, I can't remember how many it is now, like 14 books. But actually, if you look at them, like
14 books.
something, I think it's something like that. 50% of them though are with other people. So I like working with other people. Yeah. And so I like collaborating, and I like sharing stuff. And so delightful. Thank you very much for inviting me back onto the show, my friend. Really nice.
My absolute honor and pleasure. Okay, Julian, I will stop. I hope we have actually been recording.
Oh, I hope we have. I mean, it's had a little red dot up in the corner, so I reckon.
Sure. Okay, Julian, thank you. Remember, send me that book now, signed. I want it.
Yeah. I'll put it on my massive to-do list, Sarah.
Cheers, Julian. See you soon, man.
See you soon, man.